So let's begin here with the idea of modernism and of the modern, right? So when I say these words modern or modernism, what do you think of? Wow, that's loud.
Creativity.
Okay, creativity. Anything else that a word like modern brings to mind?
A lot of people would say shiny or new.
Okay, shiny or new. Anything else? Just give it a minute, think about it.
Think of, not that it's necessarily the same as modernism, but surrealism and aestheticism.
Okay, so yeah, these are particular movements that are related to modernism, right, or that are a part of modernism. Okay, good. And think along those lines, like if you guys have talked about modernism in past classes, right, think about that kind of stuff as well. Aestheticism, surrealism.
Like a trend, like
okay.
You're trying to keep up, like modern, like keep keep up with the
Okay. As in, like, like the need to be modern. Right? To be modern is to be in step with your time, and maybe even slightly ahead of it, rather than falling behind. Okay, good. Anything else?
I feel like it's a time frame. Like there was
okay.
like I don't want to say like there's like a set event, but there's like the past and now we're like in the modern times.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, you're pointing to something that is like, this is something in literary study, right? That we tend to divide eras up into, we tend to divide literary history up into distinct periods, right? So if we're looking, for example, at what, like say what I cover in Brit Lit 2, right? I usually start there. Oh. Years have 4 numbers in them, not 3. For now. I usually start in the Romantic period. And then go to the Victorian period. And yeah, when we talk about the modern period, we are talking about a distinct time frame, right? A distinct set of years between the death of Queen Victoria and the end of World War II, right? And then anything after 1945, we tend to regard as contemporary or postmodern. Even though that 1945 date, right, as it recedes further and further into the past, starts to feel a lot less contemporary, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages to thinking of literary history in these terms, right? What might be the advantages of splitting literary history up into periods like this?
Simplicity, see?
Okay, yeah, it's simple, it's easy to grasp, right? What were you going to say,
I
Samantha?
was going to say it would be easier to like study it if you can just say like this is these are the works, this is
Yeah, it makes it a hell of a lot easier for me to make a syllabus, right? If I say, okay, this is modern British literature, okay, so I'm going to just only assign things that are in this set date range, right? And yeah, it does tend to give you a particular focus. So usually what we'll do is we'll assign a couple of key characteristics to a particular period, right? That like this is what the dominant literary values were in this period. And these are the values that define it, right? So what are some potential drawbacks to this way of thinking about literary history?
things get excluded.
Yeah, a lot of things are going to get left out, right? Things that don't fit the values of the period that you've decided on, right? Even if these are things that were really popular or influential in their own time, are just going to get dropped from the canon, right? People just aren't going to read them or study them. So yeah, there is that problem of exclusion, right?
It's kind of like putting everything into a cookie cutter mold, and if it doesn't fit, then it doesn't.
Yeah. If it doesn't, it's like, I don't really know what to do with this, so I'm just going to leave it over here. Yeah. Like like those extra scraps of dough that you're left with after, like, say, making cookies or making biscuits, right?
They're sometimes the best.
Yeah, not with biscuits. Usually the biscuit you make out of scraps is usually a little bit chewy. But with cookies, yeah, absolutely. What other potential drawbacks are there to this?
What do you do with something that fits in two different periods?
Yeah, we give everything these kind of clean dividing lines, right? But what do you do with, like, do all the romantics just disappear after 1832? In fact, yeah, several of the early romantics, in the Victorian period are still alive and still writing, right? William Wordsworth was still alive and writing. He was writing shit, but he was still writing.
They fall into a gray area.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, so yeah, if I'm teaching a poem that Wordsworth wrote in 1850, right? Do I teach that in the Romantic period, or do I teach it in the Victorian period? And, there are still writers in the Victorian period who are working with what are essentially Romantic values, right? So we like to act like these kinds of like these periods are kind of hermetically sealed off from each other when they're really not. And oftentimes what they're defined by is the preferences of a particular set of scholars, right? Now there are certain, 1901 is a nice clean date for ending the Victorian period, because that's when Queen Victoria goes kaput, right? But even within the Victorian period, there are several different complementary and contradictory literary movements and tendencies, many of which inform modernism. So we're not really going to go by a strict date period definition here, right? What I've determined as the date period for this particular course is about 1885 to 1939. So we're going from the decadent movement in late 19th century Britain, which we'll talk about in more detail next time, because it's directly relevant to the picture of Dorian Gray. And we're ending with the beginning of World War II, right? The last text that we're reading in this class is Louis MacNeice's long poem, Autumn Journal, which is written just as World War II begins, right? So that's going to be our end point here. So it would probably help if we think about what exactly makes this period modern, right? Now, some of it has to do with new ways of thinking that are actually quite a bit earlier, right? That come in the middle to late 19th century and have an enormous amount of influence on the way intellectual history and culture develop. So I'm going to put a couple of names on the board, and you tell me if you recognize any of them. These are in no particular order, by the way. which of these names do you recognize?
Marx, Freud, Darwin, and Nietzsche.
Okay. Is it the same for everybody?
Pretty much everyone except the last one.
Okay. So nobody knows J.G. Frazier. You do.
I've heard the name Frazier before. I can't remember what class, but I know I've heard it, and we've briefly discussed it.
Uh-huh.
I don't know the last one.
Yeah, you both took Brit Lit 2 with me, right?
Yes.
Yep.
We talked about Frazier when we talked about The Wasteland.
That's where it's from.
Mhm.
I knew it.
Okay. So yeah, so maybe we'll start there because Frazier's ideas are unfamiliar to everybody, right, or to most of you. So J.G. Frazier was a Scottish anthropologist who wrote a book near the end of the 19th century, a very, very, very long book, but also a deeply influential one called The Golden Bough. Is this ringing a bell for anybody? Okay, so The Golden Bough was a study of magic and religion, right? Kind of throughout history. And Frazier's basic idea was that most world religions and world mythologies follow a kind of basic seasonal pattern, right? Where you have a god who, say, like, dies in the autumn and is reborn in the spring, right? And so he points to a number of different mythologies and religions in which, you know, this is the case. So you've got the Norse Balder, the Egyptian Osiris, the Middle Eastern Attis or Adonis. He puts the Christ story into the same framework, right? So he's arguing that most myths share this same basic deep structure, right? That is based on a kind of fertility narrative. And that they're all essentially telling the same story, or a version of the same story. Okay, so let's then note some of these others here, right? And then we're going to kind of look for common patterns, right? Common threads here. What do you all know about Karl Marx?
Socialist theory?
Okay, yeah. He is a socialist thinker, right? Not the original socialist. He didn't invent the idea. Nor did he invent communism, right? These were both earlier ideas that he then kind of comes up with the most popular and best-known versions of, right? What else do you know about Marx? What else do you know about Marx's theories, if anything? Yeah, Hannah.
No, it's called Marxism.
Okay.
I've been told I do good Marxist writings.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, like Marxist, that Marxist critical approach, just so everybody kind of knows what's going on here, is it's kind of what I do in classes like this, or it's more concerned with historical context and how that shapes culture, rather than with, you know, the individual genius of particular authors, right? So the basic influence of Marx here, though, on modernist thinking, right, is, well, it kind of comes down to a couple of ideas, right? One is this notion of alienation. Right, so Marx is looking at the capitalist society that's emerging in Europe in the 19th century. And he sees that most of the gains and most of the economic gains from an individual's labor are going not to the laborer, but to the person who owns the machine that that person works on, right? So alienation is this idea that you are separated from the fruits of your own labor and someone else is getting them, right? It also refers to the way people working in an industrial society are kind of cut off from traditional patterns of rural village life, right? You know you're alienated from your original community, and that you're now kind of working in this faceless mechanistic environment, right? Now, the other thing that is particularly influential in Marxist thinking is this notion of permanent revolution, right? That is, that in each era, ownership of the means of production changes, right? More or less inevitably. Like we're kind of moved along on the tides of history, right? And so the capitalist era will inevitably give rise to a socialist era, which will then give rise to a communist era, right, in which all property is owned in common. I'm probably not explaining this all that well, right? But it's basically like a kind of a relatively passive view of history, right? That these are things, that history is something more just kind of that happens, right? Rather than something that is moved forward. So let's talk a little bit about Freud. What do you know about Freud?
He was a psychologist.
Okay, yeah, he's the father of modern psychoanalysis, modern psychology, right? There are psychologists before Freud, but Freud is just about the only one of them we still talk about, right? Yeah, Hannah, what were you going to say?
Dreams.
Okay, yeah, Freud is very much concerned with dreams, with the interpretation of dreams.
He's kind of kooky.
Okay, what's kooky about Freud?
The way he interprets things.
Okay.
It's been a minute since I did anything with him, but I clearly remember thinking that the way he interpreted certain things to mean this, that, or the other was just kind of kooky.
Yeah, so
different.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about the way Freud looks at dreams, right? A dream is for Freud always a kind of allegory of your unconscious drives, right? So Freud splits your mind up into three basic parts, right? Right, there's the ego, right, which is your sense of self, right? The I that you're aware of. And most of the ego is conscious, right? This is, what you're actually aware of in your day-to-day. Now, the ego is formed by the push and pull between two other submerged forces that you have a lot less control over and you're generally not aware of, right? Does anybody know what they're called? Or remember what they're called?
At one point in time, I could have answered that, but that was not that point in time.
All right. Well, after today, you will be able to answer that again. So the first is called the id. Is this ringing a bell for anybody? Does this sound familiar? What's the id?
What about like your subconscious?
Well, these are both your subconscious. But the id and the superego are both subconscious, right? So the id is essentially kind of like your basic animal drives, right? The id is the part of your brain that wants attention, it wants food, it wants sex, it wants what it wants, and it wants it right now, and nothing had better get in its fucking way, right? The superego is the weight of social approval and disapproval, right? So it's essentially the part of you that cares about how others see you. So why don't we all just run around this building with no pants on, screaming our heads off?
Because
that is frowned upon in society.
Exactly, because other people would disapprove, right? That would make other people not like us.
Also, it's very cold.
It is also really cold right now, yes.
It's really cold.
But yeah, so because we know that this would lead other people to judge us harshly, right? We don't do these kinds of things. So the superego isn't really a conscience, right? It's not really a moral sense. It's more about your awareness of other people's values and other people's judgment, right? And so these two things together form your ego. And they're both necessary. Like when they're in balance, you have a healthy functioning psyche, right? You need a functional id and you need a functional superego when you're able to go through day-to-day life, right? Somebody whose superego overbalances their id becomes really timid, right? And unable to do anything. Like they're always afraid of, what people are going to think of them if they do this or that, right? So they just don't do anything. Somebody whose id is out of control doesn't care enough about what other people think about them, and then just does whatever the hell they want, right? So the primary thing to remember about Freud, the primary thing to be aware of when thinking of Freud and his influence on modernism is this theory of the unconscious, right? And his tendency to interpret dreams as allegories of this unconscious struggle between your id and your superego, right? What about Darwin? What do we know about Darwin? Yeah, okay. Yeah, he comes up with the modern accepted theory of evolution, right? Again, there are earlier evolutionary theorists, but they have mostly been discredited by now, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Natural selection and like survival of fittest. So parts.
Yeah. So Darwin's basic theory, right, is that organisms change and evolve over time, right, by kind of like selecting for characteristics and breeding that give the next generation a greater chance of survival, right? So to give you an example of this, polar bears and grizzly bears are technically the same species, right? Biologically, there's no difference between a polar bear and a grizzly bear, right? But one bear has a mutation that allows it to survive in an Arctic environment, right, against a white backdrop, right? Whereas the other bear maintains the brown fur, where the mutation would be a disadvantage, in a forest setting, right? A bear running around with white fur in a forest stands out, and thus has less chance of sneaking up on prey, right? But this basic idea of evolution, what's really more important here for our purposes and for thinking about common threads here is the idea that evolution kind of unseats in the popular consciousness, right? The Judeo-Christian religious notion that human beings were created in their present form and the world is created for them, right? If Darwin's theory of evolution is true, then the basic implications are that our existence is, essentially the end result of a process we had no control over, that has just kind of passively developed us over time, right? Is anybody noticing any kind of common threads here yet?
Scientific rationalism?
Okay, yeah, there's an influence of scientific rationalism. Good. Yeah, all of these theories are kind of mechanistic in a way, right? They're kind of like that, society works basically like a machine, or in some cases maybe like an organism, right? Yeah, go ahead, Bree.
I may be wrong, but I kind of am picking up on It has a lot of social aspects to it, like
Okay.
how society perceives the individual, what
Okay.
the individual gets from society,
Yeah.
what they put into it.
Yeah, this is a lot of this is about the changing idea of the individual's role in society, right? Good. And what about the basic attitude here towards what would have been, even in the 19th century, kind of like still the basic pillars of society, aristocracy and religion.
A lot of these people are questioning religion.
Yeah.
It's all about questioning, is it real, where does it come from? And I think a lot of it has to do with control and whether or not we actually have control over anything.
Yeah, and a lot of these theories suggest that we don't, right? That we're not in control of our lives. That there are other forces that we're not even aware of, right? That move us in particular directions. So yeah, so there is, on the one hand, there's that questioning of institutions, right? A kind of distrust of institutions. But it's accompanied by a kind of anxiety over whether or not we really have any agency in our lives, right? Or whether we're all just participants in either some kind of great big kind of moving, rationalist machine, or some reenactment of deeper, older mythic structures, right? That are buried somewhere in our subconscious. I think maybe where we want to try to tie all this together is in the sometimes terrifying Friedrich Nietzsche. What do y'all know about Nietzsche, if anything, about Nietzsche's philosophy?
He's a big old downer.
I guess it depends on how you look at it, yeah, but okay. Yeah, he can be a downer.
I can't say his name.
Nietzsche?
I probably.
Okay, so the basis of Nietzsche's argument, right, most of his arguments, is that nothing in the world has any inherent meaning. Right? That meaning isn't a given. That's just out there in the world for us to perceive or pick up on, right? That meaning in the world and in life is something that human beings create for themselves and assign to things, right?
Did we talk about this in a class with you?
Almost assuredly.
Because I remember you talking in a lecture one time about a table or a desk and how it has no meaning, but you can give it meaning.
Okay, I
I
think,
just keep remembering
yeah,
that.
I think that usually when I'm using the table example, I'm talking about Plato. And Plato's notion that all objects in the world, like all physical objects we can interact with, are imitations of an idea, right? That I can build a table. I'm not handy, so I would build a shitty table. But I can build a table because I can because there's an idea preformed in my brain of a table, right? And that all objects in the world are just inferior imitations of ideas. So that's Plato. So that's going way back to ancient Greece, right? Nietzsche's more concerned with the present and how to survive in the present in a world that is emptied out of meaning, right? So he says there are basically two ways you can respond to the fact that nothing has any meaning. One is to go on pretending that it does, right? You can delude yourself into thinking that you have some kind of responsibility to the world as it is and to maintaining the status quo and to order and duty and things like that, right? Or you can decide to strike off on your own, admit that nothing has any real meaning, and kind of accept the freedom that comes with that. Right? So he uses a thought experiment as an example, right? So bear with me for a second, right? And imagine that you are falling down a bottomless pit. You are never not going to be falling. This is your condition for the rest of eternity, right? You will never hit bottom, you will never die. Meanwhile, sitting on your shoulder is a little demon that keeps whispering in your ear, it never gets better. It never gets any better. Psst, did I tell you it doesn't get better? Right, constantly. So, the superior sort of person for Nietzsche would find strength and security within themselves to survive the ordeal, right? Say, okay, this is what the basic terms of existence are, right? I'm falling without a net and I'm never not going to be falling. I have to accept this and deal with it. While the inferior sort of person would start screaming, freaking out, scrabbling to find a handhold, right? Doing whatever they could to try to maintain the illusion that something's going to save them, right? And these are the basic intellectual backgrounds to a lot of modernist thought and literature, right? So there's this notion, this kind of like, on the one hand of what, like, you know, kind of freedom to create something new out of the detritus of the old world. But at the same time, a kind of fear over what shape that newness is going to take, right? As we come to the end of things, or the end of the old order, what do we build out of it? And, you know, to be honest, a lot of the early years of the 20th century don't suggest that what's going to come out of it is anything particularly promising, right? If we look at some of the key events that are lurking in the background of modernism. Right, if we take 1901 as our start date, you have the death of Queen Victoria. Now, what makes this significant, right, is that Victoria took the throne as a very young woman in 1835. So, she rules Britain, right, as a kind of stable center in public life for almost 70 years. And then she dies. And her oldest son, who's already an old man, takes the throne, right? And so this is, it's a kind of destabilizing event, right? You had, you know, this kind of national mother figure who was always there, and now she's gone. And then from 1914 to 1917, we have, can anybody tell me?
The Great War.
Yeah, the First World War, right? Which is then followed by a terrible worldwide flu pandemic. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and we have a global depression, right? And then from 1939 to 1945, we have yet another world war, right? So this is a historical period that, broadly speaking, is marked by conflict between different political ideologies, by the destabilizing of old regimes and old empires, right? Not just England and the British Empire, but the whole map of Europe is remade, right? The whole map of Africa is remade. New governments spring into existence at the end of this period, right? So after a period of kind of lengthy stability in European history, we do have these kind of roughly 40 years of great upheaval and change. And a lot of this change is also driven by technologies that were new in the 19th century, but were really only coming into their own at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, right? So, can anybody think of any transportation technologies, for example, from the 19th century that kind of would have revolutionized the way people lived?
Wasn't it like the railroad? Is that one?
Yeah, the railroad. The first steam railroad is built in England in 1804. And by 1901, railroads are not just all over Europe, but all over much of the world, right? Now, railroads and factories actually revolutionized more than just travel. How are most factory workers paid? Like, in what kind of increments?
By the hour.
By the hour. Yeah, they're paid by the hour, right? And if you're running a railroad, what do you need to make sure is happening at every station on that railroad?
Punctuality.
Yeah, that the clocks all have to be aligned with each other, right? When people lived in primarily agricultural societies, time didn't really matter that much. You got up at sunrise, you worked until noon, you came home, you ate, you went out and you worked again until sunset, and then you came home and went to bed, right? So, you followed whatever the rhythms of, the natural rhythms of the day, right? It didn't really matter if you could tell what time it was precisely. However, when people are traveling, like when somebody's waiting for a train, right? How many of you have ever had to wait for a late train? Okay, yeah, it's like, you know when it's supposed to be there, right? And you see the minutes ticking by, and you start to get pissed, right? People expect the train to be there when it's supposed to be. So yeah, not only did this revolutionize transportation, it also revolutionized the way we deal with time, right? In that precise measurement of time actually became important. Okay, other 19th century transport technologies, anybody think of any?
Horseless carriage.
Yes! The first viable modern automobile is invented in 1886 in Germany. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this is not a technology that's widely adopted yet. Automobiles are primarily kind of like a hobbyist speed machine, right? So auto races are a big deal. But ordinary people aren't really driving around in cars yet, right? We also have the advent of steamships, transatlantic steamships in 1813. So the upshot of all of this, right, is that people are using technology to get around faster and to go further more quickly than they would have in previous generations, right? And the invention of the transatlantic steamship also leads to another era-defining tragedy. Can anybody think of what it would be?
The Titanic.
Yes, the sinking of the Titanic in, I wrote this down somewhere, 1912, yes. We can fit this in here, right? You know, one of the ultimate examples of technological hubris, right? They build this enormous, supposedly unsinkable ship in Belfast. This, you know, kind of symbol of, you know, in a lot of ways, of, you know, British national pride. And then it sinks on its maiden voyage, right? Because they didn't put in enough lifeboats. And because they tried to run, the captain tried to run it too fast. And so didn't have time to avoid the oncoming iceberg. Now, the other big technological revolution that's important here is primarily in the arts. Right, the phonograph is invented by Thomas Edison in 1877. So you can now record basically any sound, right? You don't have to go to a concert hall to hear a symphony orchestra. You can buy a little wax cylinder with grooves etched into it that will reproduce the sound. Right? It will reproduce the sound poorly. It'll sound like shit, right? But you won't have to actually go anywhere. You can listen to recorded sounds in your own home. Right? Photography. Is an even older technology. It's invented in 1825. But by the end of the 19th century has now been widely adopted as it becomes faster, easier, and cheaper. Though still not to the point where, you know, ordinary people are buying their own portable cameras. And finally, we have the motion picture. In the 1890s. So one thing that these inventions do is they kind of democratize art a little bit, right? It takes special training and education to be a painter or a sculptor. But the logic of the time went, anybody can point a camera and take a picture. Now, I would argue that to take an artful picture is also a skill that requires education and training, right? You know, if you need any questions, if you have any questions about that, just, you know, look at any of my photo albums, most of which feature my thumb really prominently. But the means of making art are more widely available, and these these new forms encourage people to experiment with form in ways that they hadn't before. So this is the basic background to the period we're going to be talking about. Does anybody have any questions about any of this stuff before I give you the reading questions for next time and let you go? So we're going to be covering next time, as we start talking about Wilde, we're going to talk a little bit about the dominance of realism in Victorian fiction, and the way in which decadent writers like Wilde challenged that realism, while also kind of playing with its conventions. I should never mention that we're done before I say, do you have any questions? It always pretty much ensures that no one has any. Okay, so let me call up the guide questions for next time. You can just go ahead and copy these down. And I will see you on Thursday to talk about Oscar Wilde. Which is the, yeah, that's it.